Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for June 10th, 2022. It's Friday, so I'll be taking your questions, but I want to begin by reporting to you on another gigantic Biden-Harris flop. The so-called Summit of the Americas, which is taking place in Los Angeles, which was supposed to be an effort to extend the power and control of the US-UK global NATO empire. Now, Biden gave a keynote address where he presented the narrative of democracy in the democratic states versus the Russian policy of unprovoked aggression. This is the line from the Summit of Democracies, the fraudulent conception that the US and the British and NATO are forces for democracy, whereas Russia, China, and other nations are autocracy, and therefore you have to stand with us to be democratic. At this conference, he announced the so-called Partnership for Prosperity, which was another complete fraud. It's essentially a green policy which would prevent the nations of Central and South America from actually adopting the kind of modern technological progress that's necessary if you really want prosperity. Instead, it's more of the green crap based on the fake science of climate change. And this is also something that many of the nations are rejecting. They're also looking toward China and the Belt and Road Initiative. So this was an attempt to counter that. Now, it was a flop, not simply because of the idiocy of Biden and his statements, but because a number of leaders did not attend. For example, Harris was touting her responsibility for getting at the so-called root causes of the immigration crisis and poverty in Central America. But the three nations she targeted in particular, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, none of them attended. López Obrador of Mexico did not attend because he objected to the exclusion of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. Maduro, the president of Venezuela, who's on tour in Turkey, in Algeria, and other countries, issued a statement saying that this conference represents the end of an era because of the boomerang effect of US sanctions, that they're not hurting Russia as much as they are hurting the countries of Western Europe and the United States and the global South. And so this was just another example of the arrogance of the Anglo-Americans in thinking they can continue to dictate a unipolar world order based on protecting the needs of the globalist corporate and financial cartels and against the interests of sovereign nations. Not surprising, given the response we've seen in the recent days from India and from other countries in the global South, rejecting completely the idea that you have to choose sides between the so-called democracies and the autocracies. Now let me get to some of the questions. I may not be able to get to all of them, but there were some very good ones. Let me just start from someone who wrote to me, have you heard of an impending invasion of the United States by China and Russia? And could the United States defend itself if such an attack occurred? This is put out by anti-Russian, anti-China networks who are attempting to gin up the Russophobia and xenophobia in the United States by claiming there is evidence that Russia and China are about to invade. This is just complete foolishness. And putting this out there is an attempt to prevent people from actually getting at the truth of the collapse of the existing unipolar order and looking for a new enemy, or not necessarily a new enemy. China and Russia are considered the old enemy. But when you hear something like this, ask yourself, what would China and Russia benefit from by attacking the United States? Do they really wish to have a nuclear war? The reason Russia is in Ukraine now is to eliminate the danger to Russia's sovereignty from a NATOized Ukraine. It's not an aggressive attempt to extend an empire, nor is China involved in an aggressive attempt to expand an empire. Pollen. Both Russia and China are engaged in a process of trying to assure there can be economic development. And so the last thing that they would wish is a war with the United States. So when you hear something like this, you just have to realize that someone's trying to pull your strings to manipulate you back into a new Cold War mentality on behalf of the military-industrial complex. Now, secondly, the couple on the financial questions, inflation and so on. Someone asked, what's the background to inflation? Can you discuss the repo crash in the fourth quarter of 2019 and why were foreign banks bailed out in this? Well, the repo is the repurchase agreement by which banks fund overnight loans corporations that don't have the cash to cover their immediately coming due obligations. And this is something that goes on all the time, that in many cases companies are cash poor for legitimate reasons, but increasingly they're cash poor because they're not making profits from their basic enterprises. But their stocks keep going up. And so to keep that process going, to appear to be solvent, they go to financial markets to get liquidity to cover short-term debt. In the case of the repo markets, it's generally been 24-hour loans. Well, at a certain point, namely September 17th, 2019, the leading banks that are involved in making these loans backed out because they were fearful that these loans might not be repaid and this could trigger a chain reaction of defaults. So the Federal Reserve stepped in. Now, at the time, the overnight loans were somewhere in the range of $8 to $10 billion at a time. Quickly, this jumped to $20 billion a night, $30 billion, $50 billion, $100 billion in overnight loans from the Fed. And it quickly extended beyond overnight to 48-hour, 72-hour, to 42 days, to what essentially became perpetual rolling over of debt. Why was that? Because these were zombie corporations that didn't make enough profit to cover the interest on their debt. Now, this occurred months before the COVID crisis hit. That is, we had a near meltdown of the financial system. And the Fed's response was exactly what it did in 2008, which is to increase the flow of federal funds, of bailout funds, I should say, Federal Reserve funds, going to the banks to be made available to their bankrupt corporate partners. Now, that's why we have inflation. And why did they bail out foreign banks, such as Nomura, Barclays, BNP Paribas, Deutsche Bank? And we're talking now about $13 trillion in the fourth quarter, of 2019, which extended into the first quarter of 2020 up to over 24 trillion. And many of those, much of that, more than 80% of that went to 6 banks, but included among them were the foreign banks. Well, there's no real difference between foreign banks and US banks because you have a global corporate cartel arrangement in which the banks are financing each other to sustain a bubble. And that's what the repo crisis was all about. And when you hear Janet Yellen, now the Treasury Secretary, former Fed chair, saying she underestimated the effects of things like coronavirus and the Russian invasion of Ukraine as the cause of inflation, you know she's lying. She knows the cause of inflation is the quantitative easing, the flooding of trillions of dollars to bail out a bankrupt bubble. That's why there's inflation. And it happened before the coronavirus and before the Russian special military operations in Ukraine. Now, someone else wrote and asked, can we establish a new financial system among Russia, China, and India to replace the bankrupt transatlantic system? Well, that's underway. It's underway on a number of levels. One, you have the February 4th China-Russia agreement. You have various kinds of national agreements, for example, India with Russia to engage in a rupee-ruble exchange system to pay for Russian energy and Russian defense systems to India. You have the Saudis accepting the Chinese yuan in payment for oil. A move toward using national currencies rather than sticking with the dollar. Now, there are a couple of reasons for this. One, the U.S. just seized $300 billion of Russian assets after seizing $9 billion of Afghan assets. Why would countries want to be dependent on the dollar when their assets can be stolen without any problem by Western banks? Secondly, with the inflation being stoked by the continued flow of liquidity into bankrupt corporations, why should countries stick with the dollar, in which institutions such as the International Monetary Fund can devalue their currency to ease the control of the dollar over their country? So we're seeing a tendency toward this, but it's not just defensive. The Eurasian Economic Union, under the direction at this point of its chief economist, Sergei Glaziev, is discussing moving toward exchanging national currencies rather than doing everything with the dollar. And the purpose for this is integration of economies. It's economic development, to fund economic development, instead of being stuck in a system where there's no credit for physical production. So yes, it's very possible this is going to happen. It could happen in an orderly way if the United States joined it, but it could lead to a disorderly collapse of the dollar system if the United States continues to insist on its role as the unipolar arbiter of all international finance. Now, finally, let me just take up a question on the January 6th hearings, which opened last night with a lot of grandstanding by congressional Democrats. One of the questions is, what do you think is the purpose of this committee? Another question, why was Peter Navarro arrested? Was that arrest illegal? Well, Navarro was arrested and charged with criminal contempt of Congress for refusing to cooperate with the House panel. Now, this is legal. It was the FBI that did it because he broke the law. But it's applied in a completely arbitrary way. If you look at the whole of Russiagate, if you look at the background to what happened on January 6th, what you see is the FBI was engaged in what you might call what would you call it? Arbitrary enforcement of the law. We see people like Roger Stone and Paul Manafort attacked in the early morning by FBI agents banging on their door with guns, with weapons, with cameras there to serve subpoenas when they would have willingly gone to the court to appear before the court without being brought in chains. Probably the same thing is true of Navarro, although I doubt it. But the point is that these are arbitrary actions to violate constitutional rights. And what are those constitutional rights? The rights to protest, the rights to assert your own free speech. Now, what's the January 6th committee? Whatever happened on January 6th, and there are a lot of questions. For example, what was the FBI role in it? Why was the security at the Capitol pretty much taken down? There are a lot of questions that have to be answered. But the people who were arrested were subjected to essentially being made political prisoners, held for long periods of time without bail. Some of them are still in prison without bail, in some cases even without charges for a lengthy period of time. It's the application of the terrorist laws against Americans. And it fits in with the narrative that if you disagree with the policy of the current administration, you're probably a right-wing extremist, a neo-Nazi, a radical possible terrorist. And so therefore they're justified in these kinds of police state measures to suppress dissent. This is a danger to our Constitution. We have to bring back the principles of the American Constitution to govern this country. And that includes economic policies, security policies, and criminal justice policies. As long as things are applied unevenly and arbitrarily, the lack of confidence in our institutions legitimately grows. And that's why we're seeing a breakdown of social and civil policy in the United States today. And that's why this is such a dangerous moment. We're going to be addressing these things at our conference, the Schiller Institute Conference, June 18th and 19th. Register to join us at theschillerinstitute.com and organize your friends. This is a crucial moment in American history where either we have a constitutional solution or we're going to have a breakdown of the United States, possible civil war, and very likely nuclear war with those countries who refuse to accept the Unipolar Order of the United States, the British, and NATO. So thanks for joining me. Sign up for our conference. I'll see you again next week.